So much for joining us. My name is Mark Klapach Matthias, and I'm here tonight representing two of the sponsors for the presentation, including the University of Wisconsin River Falls Office of Sustainability. My name is Mark Klapach Matthias, and I'm here tonight representing two of the sponsors for the presentation, including the University of Wisconsin. Sorry about that. All right, sorry about that. I had the same presentation pulled up on another screen ready to go. I was just sharing the link with somebody. So again, my name is Mark Klapach Matthias, and I'm here representing the University of Wisconsin River Falls Office of Sustainability and Hope for Creation. In addition to those two sponsors, our other sponsors include Powerful Choices through the City of River Falls and our host, the River Falls Public Library. Before we get into tonight's presentation, I want to highlight a few items. Tonight's presentation is the last presentation in our sustainability series for this academic year. We do plan to continue this series next year, so if you have ideas for topics or speakers that you would like to see us bring through the Sustainability Speaker Series, please feel free to email me at sustainability@uwrf.edu. I also want to remind everyone of an upcoming event. EarthFest 2022 is this Sunday at Glen Park. It will be a free event for the community, and it will be a celebration of past, present, and future sustainability efforts in River Falls and the surrounding area. This family-friendly event includes live music, fun family activities, food sampling, a sustainability fair with over 45 local organizations, free giveaways, opportunities to look at electric vehicles and possibly drive electric vehicles, and much more. So please come out to Glen Park on Sunday from 2 o'clock to 5 o'clock p.m. More information can be found on the Hope for Creation RF website. Kim will put that here in the message in a little bit for all of you to capture that website. I would now like to introduce tonight's speaker. Dr. Christie Manning is the Director of Sustainability and faculty member in the Department of Environmental Studies at Macalester College in St. Paul, Minnesota. She has a bachelor's degree in human factors engineering from Tufts University and a PhD in cognitive and biological psychology from the University of Minnesota. Her recent co-authored publications include a 2021 academic textbook, Psychology for Sustainability, a 2018 edited volume, Psychology and Climate Change, and a 2017 review article in the journal Science, Beyond the Roots of Human Inaction, Fostering Collective Effort Toward Ecosystem Conservation. Her research focuses on how people respond to the climate crisis, and she is particularly interested in the psychological circumstances that motivate community-level climate action. We are so thankful to have you here with us tonight. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Dr. Christie Manning.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Mark, and thank you to everybody who's out there. I was telling a student just a minute ago, I won't know how many of you are out there till the end. There could be 5 of you, and there could be 500. I assume it's somewhere in between. And I guess I should also say you may hear noise in the background. One of the things about doing these events via the online formats, Zoom and Teams and so on, is that you may hear my dog. And she's usually calm and quiet, but tonight for some reason she's whining at the door. So, it's going to be okay, Bina. You just gotta wait 45 minutes, and then I can let you out. There's students on the other side of the door, and she wants to go hang out with them. So, as Mark said, my name is Christie Manning, and I teach in environmental studies at Macalester College. I also work in the sustainability office, and one of the things that I have most recently been exploring in my research and in my teaching are the mental health impacts of climate change, the climate crisis. And a lot of what I'm going to tell you is contained in this report, which came out in November of 2021. So what is that, 6 months ago? And it is available to download if you just Google mental health and our changing climate, Eco America, or American Psychological Association. So I'm going to share basically a summary of this report, along with some of my experiences with young people, especially students here at Macalester. And I'll also talk a little bit about what we can do about the mental health impacts of our changing climate. So I think about the mental health impacts of climate change in basically 3 categories. And indeed, that is how we divide them up in the report that we put together. I wrote it with Dr. Susan Clayton and also 2 people who work for Eco America. So I think of the 3 categories of climate change mental health impacts as being, first of all, the trauma that one experiences and the cascading impacts of that trauma from an extreme weather event. And we all know that those are increasing because of the climate crisis. Then there are the impacts from slower chronic changes, and I'll talk more about those later. And then climate anxiety, which you may also have heard about described as climate grief or eco anxiety. It's a large category of us feelings of helplessness, sadness, hopelessness, grief, worry, concern. And I'll talk a little bit more about this when we get there, but I've sort of settled myself on calling the climate specific kind of impact climate anxiety. All right, so first of all, the acute events and the mental health impacts from experiencing something so traumatic. Now, climate change is changing the so much about our planet, including precipitation patterns, including the entire climatic regions are shifting toward the poles. Here in Minnesota and probably in Wisconsin too, you can plant certain plants in the garden that used to be in a different planting zone. Some of the changes that you hear about on the news are the increase in extreme weather events. The far left of the screen is a flood from Duluth, Minnesota. In the middle, there's a picture of the aftermath of the Paradise wildfire in California. And then on the right is the aftermath of an ice storm in Minnesota. So all of these types of extreme events and many more are increasing as a result of climate change. And what happens to mental health after an extreme event like this? Well, what we know from the psychological literature, and I'll say that the report that I worked on with Susan Clayton, we reviewed the last 15 years of literature, all of the psychological studies done on the mental health impacts of climate-related impacts. And what we found was that indeed, climate-linked disasters lead to negative mental health impacts in a significant number of individuals. Now, many, even most individuals, are able to recover from experiencing a traumatic event. You may experience an extreme storm or a flood, your house may be inundated, you may feel in fear for your life, but over time, the trauma recedes and you're able to move on with your life. But a significant number of people, and the studies find anywhere between 5% on up to the mid 40s% will experience, after the short-term trauma and shock, they'll experience long-term symptoms of PTSD. They may experience longer-term anxiety, depression, substance abuse. They may also experience poor physical health as a result of the trauma and the lingering aftermath and the stress. And then there may also be some strains on social relationships. And this is particularly the case if people are displaced from their homes. So, for example, in some of the wildfires we've seen out west, where entire communities have been burned to the ground, people have to leave. The trauma of that is magnified compared to the kind of thing that has been experienced in my family, where there's been an extreme storm, we've been nervous, maybe a tree fell on part of the house, but we've been able to recover, get things fixed up. But in the case where you have to move, you maybe have lost a pet or maybe lost a loved one or certainly lost property, the trauma is increased. And in addition, displacement leads to a often diminished community cohesion. So it's people suffer from the trauma, and then normally, if you experience a trauma, there's an outpouring of support. And this does indeed happen for people who experience an extreme event. But what typically happens is the outpouring of support is early in the recovery period. And then over time, you are still struggling and you still need support, but people end up feeling forgotten because the support tends to come early and then it dissipates over time. And then if you have been displaced, or if many people in your community have also been impacted by the extreme event, you don't have your usual support networks to call upon for help. And also you may not have the church building may not stand anymore where you used to go to meet with your community, or the public library, or the community space, whatever it might be. So community cohesion is often impacted, and that also increases the likelihood that people will feel more of the anxiety, depression, substance abuse, PTSD. And then I'll also say that in the case of both communities and individuals, what we're seeing right now, and I'm sure we're going to see increasingly, is that the types of floods that are called 500-year floods or 1,000-year floods, they're happening more frequently. We're having 2,000-year floods in the space of 10 years, or 2 100-year floods in the space of 3 years. And the less time that people have to recover and get back on their feet between these kinds of events, the more likely it is that they will experience mental health, negative mental health impacts afterwards. So that's the first category. The second category of mental health impacts that we see verified by the psychological literature from climate change are those impacts that come from the slower, chronic changes of the climate crisis. And those are the heat, an increase in heat, an increase in drought. Drought and desertification is spreading in many parts of the US and around the world. And then we're seeing also a decrease in air quality, which is both because of the changing of the atmosphere because of the increase in greenhouse gas emissions, human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, but also what we're doing when we burn fossil fuels is we're adding pollution, we're adding particulate matter. So our industrial economies are also decreasing air quality, and climate change is exacerbating that. So those are the slower chronic changes that we highlight in the report, and for which there's abundant data that they impact mental health. Individuals are impacted, first of all, through physiological stress. Heat makes you uncomfortable. I'm sure those of you who have experienced the unusual higher than 100 degrees days in Wisconsin or in Minnesota, it's really uncomfortable. You may not have air conditioning. People tend to get irritable when heat increases. We also see an increase in elderly people who are confused. So because of the way that the blood flows to the brain and increased sensitivity to heat in elderly people, it can actually accelerate the signs of dementia. Heat can. And then both because of heat and because of air pollution and decreased air quality, we see a higher use of emergency health services. Individuals are also impacted by heat and by drought and desertification and by decreasing air quality because of the uncertainty and stress. So my sister lives in California, and she sent me actually a text just today. And every time it rains, she sends me an excited text. Hallelujah, it's raining. When they have a long period without rain, her texts get more and more dispirited. Like, oh my God, what is going to happen this year? How close are the fires going to come to us this year? So the sense of uncertainty and stress because of this long drought period happening out west. The uncertainty and stress is particularly felt by farming communities. And we see a spike in farmer suicide actually around the world because of drought. And drought exacerbates. It's not that drought alone is causing the spike in farmer suicide, but farmers are already facing such a combination of circumstances, economic and other circumstances, that make farming a really tough livelihood, and drought is seeming to push some farmers over the edge. And we're seeing evidence of a spike in suicide around the world. And there's a picture of a soybean farmer in somewhere in the United States. The individuals also, in particular, people from communities or from professions that rely on a close connection to the land. We see this in farmers. We may see it in hunters and people who like to fish, people who like to do other sorts of outdoor activities professionally or as hobbies. The more your identity is being a person who works in this outdoor or enjoys these outdoor activities, the more that the changing landscape, because of increasing heat and because of drought, the more those things eat away at, well, who am I if I can't do these things anymore? Who am I if I'm not a farmer? We also see this in many indigenous tribal communities in Minnesota and beyond, that as the landscape changes, identity suffers. And in addition to identity, there's a disruption in your rootedness in a place, which also informs your identity. And that can also be really painful, to feel like your place is changing and you want to be connected to it, but you don't recognize it anymore. And people also, and the literature also reports a loss of autonomy and sense of control of your own life. And at the community level, what we're seeing because of increased heat and drought and desertification and air quality, loss of air quality, or decreases in air quality, is we see, in particular, again, in indigenous cultures, a loss of culture, an inability to practice cultural life ways, traditional life ways. And that leads to a lot of mental distress, a sense of insecurity, and diminished self-worth. And there's also quite a bit of research showing that hostility and aggression, both between individuals and between groups, increases as heat increases. And here's my puppy saying hello. And this intergroup, increase in hostility and aggression puts strain, obviously, on social relationships. It leads to things like an increase in violence, domestic violence, violent crime. It can also lead to an increase in larger scale conflict, like civil war, terrorism, and other types of large scale conflict between groups. And part of that is due to some experimental studies where they increased heat in the room. This is morbidly fascinating, but they increased heat in the room, and then they asked people to express their attitudes toward certain groups of people who are often viewed somewhat hostilely, and this hostility increased as the temperature went up. And so you can see how that could also contribute to larger scale conflict, especially when there is a scarcity of important resources like clean water. All right, now I'm going to move on to the third category, which is the category of climate anxiety. And climate anxiety, as I said before, is one term among many that you may have heard of out there. I think of climate anxiety as a more forward-looking concern about climate change and about future. Climate anxiety is particularly present among younger people, although people of all ages are expressing climate anxiety. There's a definitely spike among younger people. Um, other types of climate emotional distress are things like climate grief, and that gets back to what I was just talking about in farming communities and in indigenous communities, feeling the environment change and feeling a lot of grief at the changes and an inability to be able to do something about the changes. Climate anxiety also comes with fear, a sense of powerlessness. People report feeling exhausted and stressed and uncertain what to do and deeply sad. And a more recent study looking at young people, ages 18 to 25, maybe 16 to 25, they asked young people from 10 different countries around the world as a battery of questions. And one of the things that young people around the world, including in the US, consistently expressed was tremendous anger toward the people who are in power, like government officials, corporate leaders, who are basically so many adults who have political and economic power, who are not taking action. Young people feel very concerned about what climate change means for their future. They know, because it is true, that we have the tools to solve this problem, and they see those who could be doing something about it not doing something about it, and they are mad. So climate anxiety does often come along with a sense of anger. And I should say that actually the anger, I think, is healthy. I think young people should be angry, and I also think that anger motivates. The problem with climate anxiety is when it becomes so tremendous in a person's life that it is debilitating. And climate anxiety, worry about the future, is actually quite a normal, healthy response to the situation that we find ourselves in, that scientists have reported in the most recent IPCC report. We should be worried about the future. And normally worry galvanizes us to action. The thing for young people is that they tend to lack political and economic power. And so they're worried. They see that this thing is going to impact their lives gravely, but they are not yet coming into the kind of power where they feel like they collectively can do something about this. It's in the hands of older people, and we older people are not taking the kind of action that needs to happen. And that helplessness and that frustration is really uncomfortable and can be unhealthy. And I see it not only among young people, but also among climate scientists. And there are reports of that sense of helplessness and frustration among climate scientists, because here they are communicating the scientific evidence that should persuade us all that action is needed, and they're not seeing an action response. And in fact, they are even seeing pushback from people in power, and in some places, and from some people, denial that is then highlighted in the news media. So scientists and young people are both particularly struck by the climate anxiety, frustration, anger. But again, it is being felt among all age groups and all demographic groups in society. Now, on the note of climate anxiety, I wanted to share with you some of the responses from some of my former and one present student. And so I'm going to share 4 photos and testimonials of young people that I've worked with. They have all given me their permission to share their words and their images with you. So the first person whose story I want to share, quote I want to share, is Dio. Dio graduated in 2020 during the pandemic from Macalester. So that's Dio, struggling to think about having children, though she would dearly love to. The next person is Sasha, who graduated in 2021. Both Dio and Sasha are still here in the Twin Cities. I'm delighted that they are. You may notice that Sasha is wearing a hat from the Sunrise Movement. That is one of the ways that Sasha has channeled his frustration and anxiety from the climate crisis. He's a leader in our local Twin Cities hub of the Sunrise Movement. Third is Evelyn. And Evelyn grew up in Los Angeles and she graduated in 2021 and has been back in LA for almost a year now. I'm still in touch with her. And I'll let you read her testimonial. As might be evident from the her testimonial, her father is an outdoor worker in LA. And then finally, Kayla, who is about to graduate. And Kayla grew up here in the Twin Cities and I hope plans to stay in the Twin Cities. And I will say that though these quotes, especially Kayla's and maybe Dio's too, may sound melodramatic, these are things that I have heard students say in discussions in my classroom. And the students assure me that they, among themselves, they are talking about these very things and using similar words, though maybe not always quite so extreme as this particular testimonial. So that's what I have to say about the mental health impacts of the climate crisis. What I want to move to now briefly before turning to the positive dimensions that and there are some things we can do. So I want to briefly talk about the ways that the mental health burdens of climate change are inequitably distributed, just like all of the impacts of climate change are hitting some people more than others. And the first group are those who live with and among us who are economically disadvantaged. And being economically disadvantaged is already linked to poorer physical health, higher risk of experiencing a violent crime, and higher risk of depression and anxiety. And those who are economically disadvantaged are more likely to be in the path of extreme weather, of an extreme event, either because they have no shelter or they have inadequate shelter, or, as is so often the case, the places to live that are available to people of very low economic means are built on the floodplain, or well, in the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about built in the more heavily concrete paved over urban centers where there's an urban heat island effect. And so they tend to be more exposed to disaster, and afterwards they have much less resource to fall back upon, especially economic resource. And this means that they're much more likely to experience more stress, more depression, more anxiety. And a second and often overlapping group are communities of color. And here I'll focus on Black Americans, especially those who are heritage slave Black Americans who really face discrimination throughout American history and even to today. And you can see the legacy of that in our cities right now. The legacy of discriminatory policies like redlining or different types of codes that and contracts that disbarred people of color, anybody but white people, from moving into certain neighborhoods. There are home loans that couldn't be given to people of color. Those areas that in the past were the areas where people of color could live, Black or African Americans could live, the redlined areas, for example, are an analysis done in 2018, 2019, and 2020 showed that, in fact, those zip codes, those neighborhoods, those blocks are have a higher heat burden during heat waves. There's more concrete, there's less tree cover, there's more outdated infrastructure, more dilapidated infrastructure, because of a history of disinvestment that continues to this day. So again, it's people who live in these areas and who live in these areas in large part because of discriminatory policies from our government and from community members just like us through history, or like me, I should say. I shouldn't presume anything about anybody out there. They are forced to endure higher heat during heat waves. And then also, like the economically disadvantaged, and because they often, people living in formerly redlined neighborhoods and in urban centers often are economically disadvantaged themselves, they then also have fewer resources to call upon, less access to the sorts of help that would alleviate some of the stress and mental health and anxiety burden that happens after an extreme storm or after a heat wave. Third, Indigenous communities. And I've already talked a little bit about Indigenous communities. We see these impacts right now, in particular in places like Alaska, so very, very cold places, and Indigenous cultures that have relied on cold temperatures for their traditional lifeways and their traditional cultural practices and food. As ice melts and as temperatures increase, it becomes impossible to do anything on ice. And these Indigenous communities are struggling to maintain their culture and community. We also see the same thing in the United States along the Gulf Coast, as sea level rise and coastal inundation is causing some communities to literally fall into the sea. And so similarly, these communities are struggling to maintain their Indigenous lifeways and traditional practices. But I'll say that I have worked with and supported some Indigenous-led climate movements here in Minnesota, and Indigenous communities in Minnesota are talking about the same sorts of things, changes in seasons that disrupt the traditional times and ways that plants were collected, or wild rice and different types of hunting and gathering. And also an Indigenous person pointed out to me during another presentation I gave, Indigenous people have been displaced since Europeans arrived to North America. And so everything I said about displacement has applied to Indigenous communities for hundreds of years now. And there is a lot of mental health burden because of climate change and because of our history. And then there are a number of other populations that are more vulnerable to climate change. And it really comes down to anybody who has less power, less access to wealth and resources in our country. So young people and children, older adults, women are often have lower economic status. And this is even more true in other places outside the United States, but we see it to some extent in the United States as well. And some studies also talk about the caregiving responsibilities of women, the increased caregiving responsibilities of women compared to men, that also mean that they are more likely to be at risk, but it may also just be that women tend to be the ones who, in the case of a divorce or a separation, that women tend to be the ones who have the childcare responsibilities. And so that makes the worry magnifies if you're worried for young people in your life. People who have disabilities, especially mobility related disabilities, but it can be all sorts of different differing abilities. The world is not set up for people in particular with mobility or visual differences. And so we often don't think about that when we make our plans for helping people evacuate an area when an extreme storm is coming. So people with disabilities struggle to get the information. They may struggle to get to the place where the transportation is available, or the place, the cooling center, whatever it might be. Individuals with pre-existing mental health diagnoses tend to be more vulnerable, in part because some medications for things like schizophrenia or anxiety and depression may make you more sensitive to heat. And then finally, outdoor workers are particularly vulnerable, especially those outdoor workers in places with little worker protections, and or the workers themselves may be migrant workers and may not have community and may not have legal protections, and feel like they have to go out and work even during a heat wave. So outdoor workers are also experiencing higher mental health burdens from climate change. So I promised that I would get to the good news. And so here I've got a couple slides of good news and what we can do. There are many things we can do. And the first thing that I would say that we can and must do is we've got to engage in systems change. We've got to do what we can as individuals to change change policy, change our communities, so that climate change becomes a higher priority than it has been politically thus far. And somebody I really admire suggested to me, and so I will pass this on to you, and that is, we each need to, at least once a month, do something that makes us uncomfortable. Maybe for me, it's something like joining phone banking. I hate that. Maybe it's going to a political convention. Maybe it's showing up in a legislator's office or showing up at a community meeting and speaking your truth about climate change. But doing something once a month to aim for collective change and systems change. There's also individual things that we can do to help ourselves through the mental health impacts of climate change. So the research shows that if you practice and cultivate active coping and a sense of agency, I do have some power, I can do something, that people who do this and who are more naturally predisposed to active coping do better mental health wise in all types of the climate impacts. People who prepare for extreme events or for drought or heat waves, people who have a crisis kit in a backpack stashed somewhere in their house, who have a little bit of a couple energy bars and some water on hand, and a list of phone numbers to call and a list of medications and all the things that you would think you might need for a couple days if you have an emergency. People who prepare feel better and do better mental health wise. There's also research showing that people who, after one flood, who then did things like raised up all of the equipment in their basement, like a boiler in my basement or the hot water heater, lifting that up so that they were comforted that the next time there might be a flood, they wouldn't have to buy all that equipment new. They also did better mental health wise than people who hadn't done those sorts of preparation things. And then also, it turns out that participating in some kinds of activism also gives people a well-being buffer. So if you are attending a march for the climate, turns out you will feel a little less climate anxiety than people who are not actively doing something that is collective level action. And I think that the reason that activism is so powerful is that, especially when you're with other people, you feel like you might actually be heard. You might actually be making a difference. All of these individual things often feel so little, such a drop in the bucket. But when you're out there with 1,000 other people, they can't ignore you anymore. And in addition, doing things with other people gives us social connectedness, and that's a basic human need, and that also increases our well-being. And then this is my last slide. I also wanted to talk about cultivating community well-being, because it's not enough to just focus on individual well-being. We really need systems change. We need collective change, and we're only going to accomplish that if we look around and work with other people to address the community level issues that are contributing to the mental health impacts of climate change. So River Falls. I know I was talking to Mark about the university's climate action plan. What about the public commitments that the city of River Falls has made to addressing climate change? Make those public commitments and make them loud and proud. Advertise them. Involve the community. Create opportunities for the community to take action. It could be an activist opportunity, or it could be installing a community solar garden somewhere, but give the community opportunities to take part. The third piece of advice, or the third recommendation, and this is also in the report, because inequality creates so much more trauma, it's really important to address disparities and alleviate the higher burdens. And it turns out that that's not only better for the people who are struggling with the most economic inequality, the people who are most in the path of harm, but it's good for the whole community. It turns out that even the people who are well off and privileged, and they actually do better after extreme events in communities where there is less inequality. So decreasing inequality and disparities is actually good for everybody in terms of mental health impacts of climate change. Have a disaster response plan and share it with the community. Build social cohesion. This is another reason why I love libraries, because libraries are the seat of community. People come together, they meet each other. We need more of those public spaces and opportunities to meet neighbors and meet community members and form alliances and form connections, because it turns out that the communities that have the highest sense of cohesion and the communities where people know each other and care about each other, they also fare much better mental health wise under extreme storms and other climate fueled conditions. And then finally, mental health services need to be expanded and prepared for the types of mental health impacts that I shared at the beginning of my presentation. So that's what I have to share with you all. This is my contact information. Thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to hearing your questions, and I hope I can answer them. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Again, for anybody viewing, you can submit your questions through the chat or the comments sections, and I'll kick things off with a couple questions that I have while we're waiting for the first few questions to come in. So I really appreciate you sharing those testimonials. So I certainly work on a college campus, and I really am having more and more of those conversations with college students, and trying to figure out how we collectively cope with that. So I really appreciate the very tangible tips that you shared for it. It kind of felt like it was planned very specifically leading up to our huge Earth Fest event, bringing the community together, taking action. I promise that was not planned for everybody watching, but it really does tie well with what is happening in the community of River Falls. So my first question for you is, what are your thoughts on the role of colleges and universities playing in addressing climate change and or the mental health crisis? And it doesn't necessarily need to be colleges and universities, schools in general, education. What do you see as that role?
Oh, I thought a little bit about this because I recently applied for a grant. I haven't heard if I got it yet, but because I do think that, well, for one thing, because the mental health impacts, climate anxiety is being felt so strongly by young people, by college age people, that colleges have and other high schools have got to be thinking about this and have got to be putting some structures in place to help students, because this is it is only going to increase. It has only increased dramatically in the 15 years that I've been here at Macalester. And so there's a practical responsibility, and it is getting in the way of some students' ability to be a student, just to do what they came here to do. And then we're already built to share knowledge, right? So what we learn in the context of the college campus or the high school campus, we can then share in a research paper or a presentation or write an article about it in the popular press. We can learn and share, and other people can take these results and innovate. And so I think it's what we do, and doing it on our campuses to serve the people who are feeling it the most seems like both a smart and an ethical thing to do, and exactly what we're meant to do anyway. And then I'll say one other thing, and that is that I'm really fascinated by the question of what does it take to keep a person engaged in climate action, even when they are feeling the weight of climate anxiety, right? Because my fear is, as more and more people feel climate anxiety, they sort of fall into paralysis and depression. And if we all stop taking action, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We won't society won't do the things that need to be done to address the problem. And there is still so much we can do. And so I'm really fascinated by the question of how can we help people feel the feelings, acknowledge the reality of the situation, acknowledge the climate anxiety, and continue to move forward to take personal action, but also engage in collective and political action. And so I was very excited to see this paper about how activism really does contribute positively to people's well-being.
Thank you. We'll see if Kim plugs any questions in here. Otherwise, I have a few more I can add in. All right. So Tova asked a question: are there models you recommend for colleges and or communities to address climate anxiety?
This is why I wrote the grant, because we are not yet at the stage where we have models where I can say, oh yeah, here's one, here's a website. People are collecting resources. I've actually been meeting with a group that we've met twice. The first time there were 75 people, and these are all mental health professionals and academics from around the country. And there were even some people from different places in the world coming together to talk about exactly this: how do we address climate anxiety? What are the best practices? What are people doing? And so there are now a couple websites and a couple of clearinghouse forums to share this information, but we're still learning and we don't exactly know. I'll say that some of the approaches that people seem most excited about, and I'm not a therapist, I'm a research psychologist, but some of the approaches are somatic based, and so really thinking about how the anxiety, the feelings are felt by the whole body, and how do we also use the body as part of the therapy. But if you send me an email, I will try to get back to you quickly. I get too many emails, don't we all? But if you send me an email, cmanning@macalester.edu, I can send you some of the web pages that I know of. There's also a young woman at Stanford. Her name is Britt Ray, Wray, and she has a blog and a website and probably all the social media called Generation Dread. And she writes a lot about climate anxiety. There's also a book by Sarah Ray, Ray in this case, and she has written a book called Climate Anxiety that I recommend as well.
Great, thank you. Tova, who asked the question, is an adjunct faculty member at UW River Falls and involved in several community organizations. So I'm going to do a shout out for one of hers. We've been doing this series called March 4th to Earth Day every Friday at 5 p.m. at Veterans Park. It started March 4th and ends tomorrow. Tomorrow's event at Veterans Park at 5 p.m. will also have representatives from the city of River Falls. They're, of course, redoing their comprehensive plan, their outdoor recreation plan, and their bike and pedestrian plan. So tomorrow is a good opportunity at 5 p.m. in Veterans Park to talk to some people involved and able to take some action. So
Yay.
Thank you, Tova, for the question, and thank you, Christie, for the answer.
And thank you, Tova, for all you're doing.
She writes numerous grants for the university and the St. Croix and Kinnickinnic River watershed. So we are very thankful to have her as part of our community. The next question I'll ask is, in your opinion, what do you think is the most important thing that an individual can do at this point in time to address climate change?
I think it's back to what I said earlier, and that is doing something that makes you uncomfortable, doing something that is out of your comfort zone, because we have all been mostly staying in our comfort zones, and the problem is not getting solved. And if we're going to solve it, we really need to step it up. And that means doing things that are not what we do in our everyday lives. It means doing things that we haven't done before, and that we may feel make us uncomfortable. We may feel we're going to make other people uncomfortable. You know, talking to legislators, really demanding from them something that makes me feel uncomfortable. It's going to make the person standing across from me feel uncomfortable, but it is how we are going to accelerate the changes that we need to see. So do something that makes you uncomfortable on behalf of climate once a month.
Thank you. I want to ask a question a little bit more specific back to, you were talking a lot about inequities and things and how, marginalized communities and things are affected disproportionately. Mental health in general, and then climate anxiety component of mental health, I would say wasn't great before COVID. COVID certainly shed light on a lot of those disparities for marginalized communities. How do you feel, that climate anxiety or eco-grief has weathered through the pandemic? I mean, is it just exponentially worse, or what are your thoughts on that?
My observations are that it is compounded by the pandemic, that the grief and the worry and the isolation of the pandemic has interacted with the worry about the climate crisis. For the very first time, I taught a class last summer, so a year ago now, where for the very first time I had a couple students who had to drop the class because of just anxiety and overwhelm, mostly stemming from the climate crisis. And I've asked myself, was that in part because we were still living under pandemic conditions? Okay, we had vaccinations, things looked a little promising during the summer there, and then kind of the Omicron wave hit, and so I think that I think they would have been better able to cope with the pandemic if they weren't worried about climate, and they would have been better able to cope with the climate if it hadn't been for the pandemic. And there's some research that backs this up as well. And then in terms of communities that are facing a higher burden, it's the same people, it's the same communities that have been harder hit by COVID, that are being harder hit by climate change. And that's a systems level thing that we've got to fix. It's just wrong. Yeah.
I was talking with the Pierce County public health officer a few weeks ago, and she said that if she thought maybe she'd have one pandemic in her lifetime that she would have to work through, just based on history, and now she's younger and going through one currently. She was like, I think there's going to be more pandemics, and that's hard. I don't think a lot of us really want to hear that, because we're still, on many levels, we're still in the pandemic and kind of in that survival mode. But the reality is, with climate change and the effects of that, we are likely facing more natural disasters and pandemic related type situations. So again, I just want to reiterate that I really appreciate the information you shared. I always appreciate the scientific background of people that actually research these types of topics and are able to provide a very concrete background of it, but then also the tips of how we move forward and how the role of taking action can help us all cope with that individually. I certainly have climate anxiety, and I think most sustainability professionals, when you work in the field, are getting more and more of that. But what keeps me going is the fact that we are making progress, and there's things that we continue to work on. So I also really appreciate your comment about just trying to engage people that might fall to the wayside or might not otherwise be engaged, because I think that really is the challenge, making sure that we are really connecting this across our campus, workplace, community, whatever it may be, to really help support each other and take some collective action. So thank you very much for all of those tips and suggestions. I will pause and just see if there's any other last minute questions that come in. Krista has asked, have you seen examples of the arts strengthening responses to climate change?
Oh, I have seen, yes. And there's, I'm a researcher, so I always have to go back in my head, like, what research have I read on this? And there is indeed research showing that art and also humor is another good one. So climate comedy, terribly funny, if the right climate comedy. But the way art works is we're all a little wary, right? And if I know I'm already worried about climate change, and I think, oh, here's this article, I can't do it, I can't read it today, but I might look at a piece of art or read a poem or watch a funny skit, right? And so that's the power of art, is that it can get around our filters and our sort of defense mechanisms that I don't want to think about this right now. And so it can also reach a wider audience because they are not as threatened or as defensive, and they may be intrigued. And then there's also just there's the kind of witty factor sometimes. Like there's an artist I wish I could remember her name. I met her at a conference, but she has gone around cities like Boston painting chalk lines where sea level rise is going, going to put the water level in X number of years. And she goes through the city doing this sort of a performance art piece. And people ask her questions like, what are you doing? What is this about? And then she engages in conversations. And I've seen, there's really wonderful climate art, very thought provoking. And I have read papers and also had conversations with some of the artists that it really does seem to be engaging people in ways that disarm. So yeah, we need some more climate art.
Great, thank you. All right, we'll see if there's any other questions that have come through. Otherwise, we'll wrap things up. We'll just pause for a second. All right, well, I don't see any more questions. Oh, there is one more.
Oh, so, examples of climate comedy.
Oh,
the Boulder, is it CU Boulder, Colorado University Boulder? Mm-hmm. There is a group there who've been, they have been curating climate comedy skits. They have a competition every year, and people put forth little climate skits, and then they have a contest and they give prizes. And so it's on their climate comedy is on, I think if you just Google climate comedy Boulder, you'll probably find their webpage, or send me an email and I can send you the link. And there are some really, really clever ones. And then I've also seen one of their scholars. Why am I blanking on her name? I wish I could remember her name. I'm sorry. She did live climate comedy at the BECC, the Behavior, Energy, and Climate Change Conference last summer. And we were working from home, and I was sitting in one room and my husband was working in the other room, and he had to actually come into the room I was in because I was in such hysterical laughter that he was wondering, I thought you were at a conference. What is going on? And so she really turned the morbid topic of climate change into this incredibly hysterically funny stand-up skit. And I would pay money in a second to see her live. It was so good. And so, yeah, do send me an email and I'll sorry about my brain and not remembering her name, but I can send it to you. And Max Boykoff is her colleague at Boulder, and you know his name.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything. This was a wonderful presentation. For everybody watching, I just want to remind you again that this is the last presentation in the series for this academic year. We do look to continue the Sustainability Speakers series next academic year. So if you have any speakers in mind or topics that you would like us to bring in, please email me at sustainability@uwrf.edu. And again, our primary sponsors for this series is Hope for Creation, the University of Wisconsin River Falls Office of Sustainability, the City of River Falls Powerful Choices, and our host, the River Falls Public Library. A special shout out to Kim, who's always behind the scenes making these broadcasts go so smoothly. So thank you, Kim. You do a wonderful job. And with that, we'll end the evening. But if you're in River Falls on Sunday, be sure to stop by Glen Park between 2 and 5 to check out our Earth Fest event, which really is a large sustainability celebration, and will provide a lot of opportunities to engage with organizations and learn more about what you can do in our community as well. So thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, everybody.